Caddis Maximus here. This time we're reviewing and comparing rolling head pry bars and small and unique kind of pry bars. And then that way I can just finish up the pry bar series of videos. Also, I only had a few of the rolling head pry bars. Those are these style, which have the really long handles and the really short heads that are very thick. These are very high leverage, tight space pry bars, but I didn't have enough of those, so I decided to include other similar pry bars and all the little small pry bars, and we can kind of compare and talk about them. Or I can talk about them. You guys can respond through the comments. So rolling head pry bars are what these are technically called. It's always kind of hard to find what this style of pry bar is until I found out that they're called rolling head, and now I have much more success. These are Harbor Freight units. I haven't done a review of them independently. I don't think I am, but they're really pretty weak. They're very cheap, but they would only be kind of abuse use. The tips really don't hold up super well. I bent some beams. I actually broke one of them, so wouldn't recommend the Harbor Freight ones. But let's go and compare some higher quality ones here. And what we have is a Mac, a Blue Point, and then a newer Proto. And as we can see, the newer generation Proto is just a little bit smoother of a head shape and a smoother finish. The Blue Point, this is an older one, and then this Mac looks like it's from the 1950s. I suspect it's much newer than that. It is one-piece forged, so it is kind of interesting how they made it. I guess all these are one-piece forged, but this one's just real kind of funky. I've had to resharpen this a few times. The head's a bit thick, so this one I don't use much, and I haven't looked at modern Macs, but I don't think they are this kind of shape anymore. But it certainly is held up. Now, with the Blue Point and the Proto, they really are pretty similar, and this is what you would find on a modern one, is they have a pretty sharp, narrow tip. That way you can actually insert it into tighter spaces, and then a nice progressive top to them. And then they round the backs a little bit, so once you get over the high point, you can really get a lot of reach, and it isn't sudden and it isn't a real tight corner, kind of like how these Harbor Freights are. Once you start rolling back real far, you have this sharp corner that may bite into whatever you're bracing against. And so that's something else to look for, is any quality one will have a rounded head, and that's why they're called rolling heads, is because you get them prying and then you roll back on the head. You do that on any pry bar, but for some reason that's what these are associated with. And many times they are alignment tools, such as this Proto. I've used this as a punch and bent the end a little bit, but it certainly held up well. So I'd recommend Proto out of all these, and probably the Blue Point as well. They do make them real small. This is from the Harbor Freight set, but all the manufacturers make a wide range of sizes. And these are just invaluable because they can get in the narrow spaces, and then you get just a ton of leverage. And it's, when you're splitting in automotive and equipment uses, these are also probably the second best, if not maybe the first best in many situations, of separating pieces of machinery, separating transmission cases, getting oil pans off, that kind of thing. Just because they're so small, you can hit the back so they actually can be driven in safely, because your hand is away from the area that you're hammering. That's one nice thing. But that you are really direct with the force, so these really can be driven in, and then you have a ton of leverage to pry something apart. This is actually a snap-on gasket scraper, but I use it as a pry bar. There's lots of interior panels. People obviously upgrade stereos, and all sorts of situations like that, or maybe even with oil pans, and especially sheet metal ones, which are kind of flexy. What's nice about this is it isn't super high strength, but it has a really thin blade. So for a variety of situations, I actually use this gasket scraper as a pry bar rather than a gasket scraper, just because it's so thin. Allows you to just really get into a variety of different spaces and makes a lot of jobs a lot easier. And then, of course, we have seal pullers here. We have a Napa one, and we have, I'm not exactly sure what brand this one is, but you can see even when it comes to seal pullers, they just have a special hook, so when there's a seal that's pressed inside a bore, these hook on and then pry one edge of the seal up, and then they have a little step so you can get various levels of reach and rocking motion. These can be resharpened if you end up damaging the tips, and actually on this one, that's what they have printed on it, is resharpen on a grinding wheel. This is obviously a much higher quality one with a double plate steel arm, and then a separate hardened steel, and it's actually thicker than the Napa hardened steel working head. Moving on, we have these things I think I found at a junkyard. These come with spare tires kits and cheaper vehicles. I don't know if it's Honda Civics, but like Mazdas and stuff, especially older ones from the 80s and 90s. But they're great little pry bars for all sorts of situations, and they're actually really easy to find at a junkyard. We have some tire levers and a little carpenter's pry bar. I mentioned this in the previous review, but I decided to include it here because you can get these tiny little pry bars, and they're great for automotive situations, especially for various wiring connectors, sometimes working with springs because you have a little slot and you can hook the spring on it. These are high quality bicycle tire levers, but I found them to be invaluable in interior work because there's lots of times where you need to apply force but in multiple areas at once, and these are great because you can just get them under any kind of area and then press them all at the same time. We have, which are brake tools or brake pry bars. To tell you the truth, I've never actually used one of these. I've done a variety of drum brakes, but I have always used slot head screwdrivers and some other tools, but I've never used these. But they're super duper handy because they're just a small version of a nice heavy duty pry bar. This is a Napa KD. What is the part number on that? 287Z, and then this is just some Japanese one. But even these kind of tools are both sold as the same thing, a brake tool or drum brake tool, I believe, and yet they have a completely different curve on this side. So it's kind of nice to have multiple ones because then you have exactly the angle that you need for any kind of prying duty, not just working on brakes, but obviously all the usual suspects. It's just so nice to have a variety of pry bars, and why I encourage people to actually kind of collect a few of these, because it actually, I've seen so many times where somebody's using, damaging something or really struggling, where I think, God, if they just had one of another common type of pry bar, it goes from being an issue where you're struggling to really not having any issue at all and being able to do it really nicely without damaging anything. I've done a review of the Harbor Freight tire levers. This is, I believe, is what people talk about when they say motorcycle tire lever. This thing is 9 inches long. I only have one of these, but they certainly make those tire levers in all sizes, and so I believe that's a motorcycle. Finishing up, these are sold at various hardware stores. These are known as small nail pullers, and we have a few different versions here. We have some Husky ones. We actually have an import Husky and an older American-made Husky, and you can see the difference between those two. The older American-made one does look a little nicer, has a little deeper chrome finish. We have a performance tool, but I wanted to mention this is another aspect. They put a corrugation on the top of this, which I thought was real innovative, because if you're prying on something, it helps prevent whatever you're working with from slipping off. This one's actually for, I believe, picture frames, and so it has an odd step that I'm going to grind off. But what's really nice about this is it's super narrow, and really is great for electrical connectors and various types of situations. And of course, non-prying tools, but I found are handy in interior work. Because this, I don't even know where I found these, just junk bins at garage sales, but they've all been handy for all sorts of thin kind of plastic stuff where you just need like a thin kind of prying tool. So, in case you're wondering why those are sitting out there. Anyway, that was the end of another kind of rambling review, but to finish up on little pry bars, and that way I have a comprehensive series of prying tools up on YouTube. And we'll be moving on to some other things. I really appreciate everybody watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Catus Maximus out. Oops, I totally forgot to talk about these last couple too. How rude would that have been? These are some odd tools. I believe these are heavier duty hubcap removing tools, to tell you the truth. But I found them just to be some of the best pry bars in certain situations, because they have this nice, about 75-degree angle, but they have this little hook on them, and that really allows them to grab under the edge of something and really pry them out. But if you look around, these would be sold as hubcap tools, and adding them would pretty much complete the prying tool set. There's so many times where I really appreciate that little hook right there, kind of grabbing on what you're prying, because a lot of times when you're prying, what you're prying against will slip off, and this little hook kind of helps it grab, so you can kind of pry and push, and then the back of the prying bar will slide, and then this will stay attached to the lip. And it becomes less struggle and a little safer. Anyway, thanks.